So today I want to try and highlight some of the ways that production and composition really come together and how you can compose your music to make the production side of things easier. I was listening to Iron Maiden the other day, specifically the Power Slave album, and one of my favorite things is how they compose these extended sessions where Adrian and Dave are playing really repetitive lead harmonies, especially on songs like Flash of the Blade and The Duelist. But if you listen closely to the background, these sections always include bass solos where Steve's playing leads and Nico's always coming in with huge drum fills. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it's definitely how I work guitar parts in my own music as well. Because of the way I produce my music, I have to make sacrifices in order to get everything to come through. Bass, drums, vocals, everything. This means I have to make cuts somewhere, especially when there's a lot going on like tremolo picking and blast beats creating a wall of sound. Sometimes this comes at the expense of the guitar. It happens occasionally on In the Nightside Eclipse by Emperor, where there's so much going on at the same time with the added synth on top that you kind of lose the riff. Obviously, I don't want to bury my riffs, so there's a technique I like to use to make sure everything comes through. I like to start songs with a cold guitar opening if I know they're going to be really heavy, like Visions and more recently Dreamer. It's just a single guitar track tremolo picking on its own before the band comes in stages. So you'll start with a guitar part, and then the second time around I'm going to throw in a bass part, and then the third time around you might get blast beats or a scream or everything just coming in at the same time. My reasoning for this is that playing the guitar on its own should give the listener a chance to sort of imprint the riff in their memory. So even if the guitars are covered during the heavier sections, you already know what the riff sounds like, so it's not completely lost. Another technique I like to use in composition is repetition, just like Iron Maiden. If I'm playing the same riff over and over again, in theory, the ears are going to start to tune them out over time and become more sensitive to changes in other parts. So by keeping the guitars constant and varying everything else around it, that should bring out the moving parts. Now, not all problems can be solved. Iron Maiden does a great job mixing their albums. Even when there's 3 guitar parts overlapped while Bruce is singing, Steve can still kick up his bass lines and not really create any problems in the mix. Part of the reason is their pro equipment and top-notch engineers, neither of which most of us have access to. But another is because of the music itself. Iron Maiden's sound as a heavy rock band is pretty heterogeneous. You have moderate tempos, rhythm-based riffing, and they all play a huge role. On top of that, Nico never double kicks. He only uses a single pedal for the bass drum. Basically, there's no wall of sound in Iron Maiden that you get in extreme metal that's an actual barrier when it comes to production. If you have blast beats and tremolo-picked guitars and bass parts, you have all this sound overlapped at once, which creates these dynamic spikes where everything's just smashed on top of each other. I'm not much of a wall of sound guy myself. I use blast beats and double kicks a lot in my music. I think it's an essential part of setting the pace within each section, but I don't tremolo pick a lot, probably less than 50%. I'd say around 20% of my guitar parts are tremolo picked. I really prefer eighth notes. You get a slightly thicker sound and the gaps help the riffs come out in production. I also never tremolo pick my bass lines either. It's eighth notes by default, and if I really want the bass to stand out, then I'll go with just single notes. Temporal separation is really something that goes a long way when it comes to mixing tracks. By nature, it's easier to hear everything when it's not all stacked on top of each other, and you don't need to compress so much to get everything to sound even. If you're doing a wall of sound, do a wall of sound. There's absolutely no reason to worry about how clean everything is going to end up in production. You can compress, EQ, and trigger some samples to get a perfectly clean sound, but really that just kind of defeats the purpose of a wall of sound, doesn't it? Just know that mixing extreme metal isn't a trivial thing. It can be really challenging to get everything to sound right. So if you want a solution, just keep composition in the back of your mind. Or rather, do the opposite. While you're composing a song, remember that you're going to have to produce it later.